They called her a traitor before anyone asked what she refused to do. The rain had been falling since dawn, steady, cold, the kind that turned the camp yard into soft mud that pulled at boots with every step. Captain Arthur Hayes noticed her before he noticed the sign. A figure against the gray. Still. Too still. She stood tied to a wooden post near the edge of the compound, where supply crates were usually stacked. Her uniform was damp, darkened by rain, sleeves clinging to her arms. Her wrists were bound in front of her, not high, not cruelly displayed, but enough to keep her from moving. Enough to mark her. The sign hung from a rough piece of cord around her neck, tapping lightly against her chest whenever the wind shifted. Traitor. The word had been painted in thick black strokes, uneven, as if done in a hurry. Arthur slowed his steps without realizing it. Around him, the camp moved as usual. Soldiers passed by carrying crates, voices low, routine intact. But there was a space around her. Not empty, not avoided, just left alone. Like a silence no one wanted to touch. He stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see her face. Pale, but not weak. Her hair was pulled back, damp strands slipping loose along her temples. Her eyes were not searching the ground. They were level, forward, not defiant, not pleading, just present. He had seen prisoners look many ways. Angry, broken, afraid. This was none of those. A corporal crossed behind him, boots heavy in the mud. Arthur didn't turn. "What is this?" he asked. The question wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The corporal hesitated. "Just a second. She's been marked, sir." Arthur's gaze stayed on the woman. "Marked for what?" Another pause. "For being a traitor, sir." The words sounded thinner spoken than it did on the wood. Arthur took a step closer. The mud shifted under his weight. He looked at her hands. Fingers relaxed. No tension in the knuckles. No signs of struggle. The rope around her wrists was firm, but not newly tightened. It had been there a while. Long enough for the fibers to darken with moisture. Long enough for most people to start moving, shifting, reacting. She hadn't. A gust of wind cut across the yard. The sign lifted slightly, then dropped back against her chest with a dull, hollow tap. She didn't flinch. Arthur's jaw tightened, just enough to be felt, not seen. "Who gave the order?" he asked. This time, the corporal looked toward the barracks before answering. "It came down through internal report, sir." She refused to cooperate. Arthur finally turned his head. "Refused how?" The corporal shifted his weight. "Medical verification, sir." She declined to sign off on a condition report. Arthur looked back at the woman. A nurse, then. That explained the steadiness. The discipline and stillness. He stepped closer again. 5 feet now. Close enough to see the faint imprint the cord had left against the fabric at her collar. Close enough to see that her breathing was even. Not shallow. Not controlled. Just steady. He studied her face for a long second. Then another. "What's your name?" he asked. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. Not weak. Elena Weiss. The accent was there, but softened. Clear. Practiced. Arthur nodded once, almost to himself. "You understand the accusation?" She met his eyes directly. No hesitation. "Yes." And a brief pause. Not for fear. For precision. "It is incorrect." No extra words. No defense. Just that. The rain picked up slightly, tapping against the wooden post behind her, against the sign, against the ground. The sound filled the space between them. Arthur glanced down again at her hands. Still relaxed. No tremor. No attempt to pull away from the rope. Nothing about her posture matched the word hanging from her neck. He exhaled slowly through his nose. The kind of breath that didn't show, but settled something inside. Behind him, another soldier approached, then slowed, sensing the moment. No one spoke. The wind shifted again. The sign struck her chest once more. "Traitor." The letters looked heavier now. Less like paint. More like a decision someone didn't question. Arthur reached up and adjusted the cuff of his glove, a small movement, precise. Habit. Control. He looked at the rope again. Then at her eyes. Then at the sign. The three things didn't align. Not in any way that made sense. "Remove it," he said quietly. The words didn't carry far. But they landed. No one moved. Not immediately. The corporal blinked. "Sir." Arthur didn't raise his voice. Didn't repeat himself with force. He simply stepped forward, closing the last bit of distance between them. Close enough now to see the grain of the wood behind her. Close enough to see the slight mark where the rope pressed against her sleeve. He reached out, fingers steady, and touched the knot. And in that moment, before the rope came loose, before anyone else moved, before the system could correct itself, something shifted that had nothing to do with orders. Something quieter. Something final. And that was the moment everything began to change. The rope gave way with less resistance than expected, fibers loosening under Arthur's steady hands, as if they had been waiting for permission rather than force. It fell away in a soft drop against the damp ground, leaving a faint imprint on the fabric of her sleeves where it had rested. No one spoke. The rain filled the silence, a steady rhythm against wood, canvas, and earth. Elena did not move immediately. Her hands remained in place for a brief second, as if her body needed to confirm what had already happened. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she lowered them to her sides. No rush. No display. Just a quiet return to herself. Arthur stepped back half a pace, enough to give space, not enough to disengage. His eyes moved to the sign still hanging from her neck. The word had not changed, but something about it had. It no longer felt like a verdict. It felt misplaced. He reached up and lifted the cord slightly, studying the rough wood, the uneven strokes of paint. Then he slipped it over her head without ceremony. The sign hung in his hand for a moment, heavier than its size suggested. He did not drop it. He simply held it. Behind him, boots shifted in the mud. A lieutenant approached, his posture tight, controlled. "Captain Hayes," he said carefully. "This action was authorized under internal discipline review." Arthur did not turn right away. His gaze remained on the sign. "Authorized by whom?" he asked. Medical oversight reported noncompliance. The report was escalated. Arthur finally faced him. Noncompliance with what? The lieutenant hesitated, then answered. "A condition clearance, sir." She refused to confirm a prisoner was stable for transport. Arthur glanced back at Elena. She stood exactly where she had been, shoulders level, expression unchanged. Rain traced down the side of her face, unnoticed. "And the patient?" Arthur asked. The lieutenant shifted. "Records indicate deterioration after transfer." Arthur held his gaze for a second. Longer than necessary. Not aggressive. Not confrontational. Just enough to let the words settle. "So she declined to sign something she believed was incorrect," he said. The lieutenant did not respond. Arthur looked down at the sign again, then extended it slightly toward the lieutenant. And this was the conclusion. The lieutenant did not take it. The space between them held for a moment, filled only by the sound of rain and distant movement from the far side of the camp. Arthur lowered his hand. Not in defeat. Indecision. He turned back to Elena. "How long were you here?" he asked. "Since early morning," she replied. Her voice carried no strain. No complaint. Just fact. Arthur checked his watch out of habit. It had been just past 0600 hours when the rain started. Now it was nearing noon. He nodded once. "You did not attempt to explain?" Another brief pause. "I was asked to sign," she said. "I declined. Nothing more. No justification. No elaboration." Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. He had spent years in uniform, long enough to recognize when someone chose precision over persuasion. It was not weakness. It was control. He removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, the leather damp from the rain. He tucked them into his coat pocket, then gestured lightly toward the medical barracks. "You will report back to your assigned station," he said. Not a suggestion, not a question, a simple redirection of reality. Elena inclined her head once. Not gratitude, not submission, recognition. She turned and began to walk, steps steady despite the mud pulling at her boots. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The space that had surrounded her before shifted, not closing, not opening, just changing shape. Arthur watched her for a moment, then looked down at the sign still in his hand. The word remained the same, but now it lacked something. Authority. He walked to the edge of the yard and set it against the side of a supply crate, not hidden, not displayed, just placed. The lieutenant stepped closer, voice lower now. "Sir, this may require formal review." Arthur nodded slightly. "Then it will be reviewed." No tension, no resistance, just acknowledgement. The lieutenant studied him for a second, as if expecting more. There was nothing else. Arthur turned and walked back across the yard, boots pulling. Free from the mud with each step, the rain easing slightly as the clouds began to thin. Behind him, the post remained. Empty now. No rope. No sign. Just wood, darkened by water, standing where it had always been. And for the first time that morning, it looked like what it actually was. Just a post. Nothing more. The rain stopped just after midday, not abruptly, but with a slow retreat, like a decision reconsidered. By early afternoon, the clouds had broken into thin layers, letting pale sunlight filter across the camp. The mud began to settle, losing its grip inch by inch, though footprints remained, evidence of movement, of hesitation, of something that had shifted. Inside the medical barracks, the air carried a different rhythm. Quieter. Measured. Metal instruments rested in clean rows. A kettle steamed gently in the corner. Elena stood at a wooden table, sleeves rolled just enough to keep the fabric dry, her hands steady as she prepared fresh bandages. No one mentioned the morning. Not directly. A young private sat on a cot nearby, watching her without meaning to. He had seen her earlier. Everyone had. He cleared his throat softly. "Are you back on duty?" he asked. Elena did not look up immediately. She finished folding the cloth in her hands, precise edges aligned, before answering. "I never left," she said. The private nodded, though he did not fully understand. Across the room, another nurse glanced briefly in Elena's direction, then returned to her work. No tension, no welcome, just continuation. As if the morning had been an interruption the day had decided not to keep. Outside, Arthur stood near the edge of the compound, his coat unbuttoned now that the air had warmed slightly. The sign still leaned against the supply crate where he had left it. The paint had begun to dry unevenly after the rain. The words still bold, still visible, but no longer sharp. He studied it from a distance, hands resting loosely at his sides. A sergeant approached, slower this time, more careful. "Sir," he said, "word is spreading." Arthur did not turn. "It usually does," he replied. The sergeant hesitated. Some of the men are unsure how to proceed. Arthur's gaze remained on the sign. "Proceed with what?" "With interpretation, sir." Arthur exhaled quietly, almost a breath of amusement without humor. Then they should stop interpreting and start observing. The sergeant shifted his weight, absorbing the answer without fully grasping it. Arthur turned then, finally, meeting his eyes. "If a person refuses to confirm something they believe is untrue," he said, "that is not disloyalty. That is restraint." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." He paused, then added, "And if orders say otherwise?" Arthur held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then the order should be looked at again. No emphasis, no defiance, just a statement placed carefully in the air. The sergeant stepped back, understanding enough to carry the message, not enough to challenge it. Arthur remained where he was for a moment, then walked toward the medical barracks. His steps were lighter now, the ground firmer beneath his boots. Inside, the room adjusted slightly to his presence, not with tension, but awareness. He removed his gloves again, more out of habit than necessity, and set them on a nearby table. His eyes moved across the space, taking in details. Order, precision, quiet work. Elena stood near the far side, finishing her preparations. He approached without urgency. She looked up as he came closer, not surprised, not expectant. "The patient you declined to clear," he said. "What was the condition?" Elena met his eyes directly. "Internal complications," she replied. "Not visible at rest. But progression was likely." Arthur nodded once. "And the report?" "It stated stability," she said. "It required my signature." Arthur glanced briefly at the table beside her, at the neatly arranged instruments, the folded cloths, the small details that required attention most people overlooked. "And you chose not to sign?" "Yes." No hesitation. No defense. Just fact. Arthur rested his hand lightly on the edge of the table, not leaning, not claiming space, just present. "Did you expect the outcome this morning?" he asked. A brief pause. "Not for uncertainty. For accuracy." "No," she said. Then, after a second, "But I understood there would be a response." Arthur studied her for a moment, the same way he had in the yard, looking for inconsistency, finding none. "You did not attempt to correct it," he said. Elena's expression remained steady. "I was not asked for explanation," she replied. "I was asked for agreement." The distinction settled between them, quiet but clear. Arthur nodded slightly, more to himself than to her. "And you chose not to agree?" "Yes." The room remained still for a moment, the sounds of small movements continuing around them. A kettle clicked softly as it cooled. Outside, a distant voice called out, routine returning in full. Arthur straightened, withdrawing his hand from the table. Your decision will be noted, he said. Not as a warning, not as reassurance, simply as acknowledgement. Elena inclined her head once. Again, not gratitude. Recognition. Arthur turned to leave, then paused briefly at the doorway. He did not look back immediately. When he did, it was not at her face, but at her hands. Still steady, still precise. Then he stepped outside, letting the door close softly behind him. The light had changed. The yard looked different now, not because anything had been rebuilt, but because something had been removed. The post still stood. The sign still rested against the crate. But the meaning that had filled the space that morning was gone. In its place, something quieter had taken hold. Something that did not announce itself. Something that did not need to. Arthur walked past the crate without stopping this time. He did not look at the sign again. He did not need to. He had already seen enough. And somewhere behind him, inside a room that had returned to its work, a decision remained. Not written, not signed, but held. By late afternoon, the camp had settled into something that resembled normal routine, but the rhythm was not quite the same. Movements were slower, conversations shorter, as if everyone had adjusted their volume without being told to. The sky had cleared fully now, a pale blue stretching above the rows of barracks, the ground beginning to dry in uneven patches. Boots no longer sank with each step, but the marks left behind remained visible, layered and overlapping. Inside the administrative office, papers were stacked in careful order, reports aligned in rows that suggested control more than clarity. A clerk adjusted his spectacles and read through a document for the third time, though nothing on the page had changed. The word appeared again in ink this time, typed cleanly, without the unevenness of paint. It looked more official, less human. He hesitated before stamping it, then set the stamp down without using it. Across the room, a senior officer stood near the window, watching the yard below. Is it confirmed? He asked without turning. The nurse refused to sign. Sir, the clerk replied. And the officer intervened. The man at the window nodded slightly. Intervened. He repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. Not overturned. Not dismissed. Just intervened. The clerk did not answer. The distinction lingered in the air. Outside, Arthur walked along the edge of the compound, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged. But something in his attention had sharpened. He noticed things he might have ignored before. A soldier pausing mid-task, watching him pass. Two men speaking in low voices, stopping as he approached. Not fear. Not exactly. Awareness. He reached the supply area again. The sign was still there, resting where he had placed it. Its edges now dry. The paint cracked slightly where the rain had soaked through. He picked it up, turning it once in his hands. The letters were bold. Certain. But certainty, he knew, was often the least examined part of any decision. He carried it a few steps, then set it down inside the storage shed, leaning it against the back wall, out of sight, but not discarded. Not erased. Just removed from immediate view. As he stepped back into the light, he saw Elena crossing the yard, moving from the barracks toward a small water station. Her steps were the same as before. Measured. Balanced. No sign of the morning in the way she carried herself. No trace of interruption. He watched her for a moment, then continued on his path. She reached the pump, pressed the handle down, and filled a small basin, the metal echoing softly with each movement. A second nurse joined her, younger, uncertain. She hesitated before speaking. Is it true? She asked quietly. Elena did not look up. What part? She replied. The younger nurse shifted slightly. That you refused. Elena lifted the basin, steady in her hands. Yes, she said. The younger woman studied her, searching for something more. And now? She asked. Elena paused briefly, then continued walking. Now the work continues, she said. No bitterness. No relief. Just continuation. The younger nurse remained where she was, watching her go, as if trying to understand how something so simple could carry so much weight. Near the far end of the yard, Arthur stopped again, this time not because something demanded his attention, but because nothing did. The absence itself had become noticeable. The post still stood where it had been that morning. Empty. Unremarkable. Just wood. Weathered and quiet. He walked toward it, his steps slowing as he approached. Up close, the surface showed marks he had not seen before. Small indentations. Faint lines where rope had pressed and released. Temporary impressions left by something that no longer remained. He reached out and placed his hand against the wood, not in reflection, not in sentiment, just to feel its solidity. It did not change. It did not respond. It simply was. Behind him, the camp continued. Voices rose and fell. Tools moved. Orders were given and followed. Structure remained intact. But within that structure, something subtle had shifted. Not a rule, not a policy, something less visible. The boundary between what was done and what was accepted had moved, just enough to be noticed by those who paid attention. Arthur withdrew his hand and stepped back. He looked once more at the empty space, then turned away without hesitation. As he walked, the sun lowered slightly, casting longer shadows across the yard, stretching forms into shapes that did not match their size. For a moment, the post cast a shadow that reached almost to the path where Elena had walked earlier. Then the light shifted again, and the shadow shortened, pulling back into itself. By evening, the reports would be filed. Words would be chosen carefully. Actions would be described in language that softened edges and preserved order. But none of that would include the moment itself. The quiet decision. The absence of noise. The lack of resistance. Those things did not translate easily onto paper. They remained where they had happened, in the space between instruction and choice, in the pause before agreement, in the simple act of not signing what was not true. And as the day moved forward, that space remained, unseen by most, but no longer empty. By evening, the lights softened into long, quiet bands across the camp, turning every surface into something slower, more deliberate. The day had not ended abruptly. It had simply thinned, like tension leaving a room without anyone announcing it. Inside the administrative office, the report remained on the desk, untouched for longer than procedure allowed. The clerk adjusted the papers again, aligning corners that were already straight, then finally lifted the document and read the line one more time. Refusal to comply. The words were correct, technically, but something about them felt incomplete. He glanced toward the senior officer near the window. "Sir," he said carefully, "should the classification remain?" The man did not answer immediately. Outside, the yard stretched in calm order, shadows lengthening between structures, movements slowing as the day approached its close. "What would you replace it with?" the officer asked without turning. The clerk hesitated. There was no category for what had happened. Not in the forms. Not in the language they had been given. "I do not know, sir," he admitted. The officer nodded once. "Then do not pretend that you do," he said quietly. The clerk lowered his eyes back to the page. For a moment, the word remained. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he drew a single line through it. Not erased. Not hidden. Just crossed. In the medical barracks, the final tasks of the day were being completed. Instruments were cleaned. Surfaces wiped. Notes recorded with the same precision as always. Elena moved between stations without hesitation, her pace unchanged, her attention fixed on what needed to be done. The younger nurse from earlier stood beside her, folding cloths with slightly uneven edges. She watched Elena for a moment, then spoke. "Do you ever reconsider?" she asked. Elena continued her work. "Reconsider what?" "The decision," the younger nurse said. "If it leads to consequences." Elena finished aligning the cloth in her hands, smoothing it once before setting it aside. "The consequence does not change the truth," she replied. The younger nurse lowered her gaze, absorbing the words slowly, as if they required more than understanding. "But it changes what happens to you," she said. Elena reached for another piece of cloth. "What happens to me is not the measure," she said. "What I confirm is." The room remained quiet after that, the kind of quiet that does not ask for more explanation. Outside, Arthur stood near the far edge of the compound as the sun lowered further, the sky shifting toward muted tones of gold and gray. A messenger approached, carrying a sealed envelope. "For you, sir," he said. Arthur accepted it, breaking the seal with a practiced motion. His eyes moved across the contents, expression unchanged. Administrative review. Pending clarification. Language that suggested process without revealing conclusion. He folded the paper once and placed it inside his coat. No reaction. No visible response. The messenger waited a moment, then nodded and stepped away. Arthur remained where he was, looking out across the yard. The post stood in its place, now casting a long, narrow shadow that stretched across the ground, touching the path, then fading into the darker soil beyond. It no longer held attention. It no longer defined anything. It simply existed, as it always had. He turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the medical barracks. A light had been lit inside, warm against the cooling air. Through the window, movement could be seen, steady, unbroken. Work continuing. Not in defiance. Not in recovery. Just as it should. He took a slow breath, then began walking back toward the center of the camp, his steps measured, unhurried. As he passed the storage shed, he paused briefly, not entering, not reaching for the sign he had placed inside. It remained there, out of sight, unchanged. He did not need to see it again. Its meaning had already been decided, not by the word written on it, but by the moment it no longer applied. Inside the barracks, Elena finished the last of her tasks and stepped back from the table. The room had quieted further, the other nurses preparing to leave, their movements softer now, the day settling into rest. The younger nurse hesitated near the doorway, then turned back once more. "Why did you not explain?" she asked. Elena met her eyes, not with distance, but with clarity. "Because explanation asks to be believed," she said. "Truth does not." The younger nurse held her gaze for a second, then nodded, something shifting in her expression, something subtle but real. She left without another word. Elena remained for a moment, alone now, the room still around her. She looked down at her hands, turning them slightly, as if confirming their steadiness. There were no marks left, nothing visible, only memory, held without weight. Outside, the last light of the day slipped behind the horizon, leaving the camp in a softer, quieter state. Orders would continue. Reports would be filed. Structures would remain. But somewhere within that structure, something had been adjusted. Not loudly, not permanently, but enough. Arthur reached the center of the yard and stopped briefly, looking once more across the space where the morning had unfolded. There was nothing to see now. No sign, no rope, no indication that anything had been out of place. And yet, the absence itself remained. He stood there for a moment longer, then continued on, his figure blending into the routine of the camp as evening settled fully in. The day had not announced its meaning. It had simply revealed it, quietly, in the space between what was ordered and what was chosen. The night settled over the camp without ceremony, the last traces of daylight fading into a quiet blue that softened edges and lowered voices. Lamps flickered on one by one, small pools of warm light against the cool air, each one marking a space where work had ended or was just beginning again in a different form. The ground, now mostly dry, held the memory of the day and faint impressions that would be gone by morning. But the memory itself did not follow the same rules. Inside the administrative office, the report had been rewritten. Not entirely. The facts remained. Refusal to sign. Intervention by a superior officer. But the tone had shifted, subtle changes in wording that removed certainty and replaced it with observation. The line that had once declared judgment now simply recorded sequence. The clerk placed the final page on top of the stack and stepped back, as if distance might confirm its correctness. The senior officer read it in silence, his eyes moving slowly across each line. When he finished, he set it down without comment. No approval, no rejection, just acceptance of what could be written and what could not. Outside, the camp had grown quieter. Footsteps were fewer, conversations shorter, the air carrying the low hum of routine settling into rest. Arthur walked along the perimeter, his coat pulled closer now as the temperature dropped. His pace was steady, not out of necessity, but habit. He passed the same structures, the same paths, but each one seemed slightly altered, not in form, but in meaning. A door that had been just a door now marked a place where a decision had been made. A path that had been just a path now carried the memory of who had walked it and why. He stopped briefly near the medical barracks. The light inside was dimmer now, reduced to a single lamp near the back. Through the window, he could see Elena seated at a small table, writing. Her posture was straight, her movements controlled, each word placed with the same precision she had shown throughout the day. There was no urgency in her writing, no hesitation, just continuation. He watched for a moment, then moved on without disturbing the quiet inside. Near the storage shed, he paused again, this time stepping inside. The air was cooler there, the smell of wood and metal lingering in the stillness. The sign remained where he had placed it, leaning against the wall, its presence unchanged. He walked toward it, then stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he simply looked. The word no longer carried the same weight, not because it had been removed, but because it had been examined. He reached out, not to pick it up, but to turn it slightly, facing it inward, toward the wall. Not hidden, not destroyed, just no longer presented. He stepped back, the action small, almost insignificant, but complete. Outside, the sky had darkened fully, stars faintly visible above the outline of the camp. The sounds had softened further, reduced to distant footsteps, a door closing somewhere, the quiet clink of metal as equipment was secured for the night. Arthur walked back toward the center, his path unbroken, his attention steady. Near the water station, he saw Elena again. She stood alone, rinsing a basin under the low flow of the pump, the water catching the light in small, shifting reflections. She did not look up as he approached. She did not need to. His presence did not change her movement. He stopped a few feet away, not close enough to interrupt, not far enough to ignore. The report will not carry the word, he said after a moment. Elena continued rinsing the basin, turning it once, letting the water run clear. It should not have, she replied. No emphasis, no relief, just alignment. Arthur nodded slightly. It will carry the refusal, he said. She set the basin aside, water dripping from its edge in a slow, steady rhythm. That is accurate, she said. He studied her for a moment, the same quiet observation as before, searching not for answers, but for consistency. He found it. You understand there may still be consequences, he said. Elena reached for a cloth, drying her hands with the same careful motion she applied to everything else. There are always consequences, she replied. Arthur held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement. Recognition. He turned to leave, then paused briefly. The patient, he said without turning back, is being reviewed again. Elena did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was as steady as before. Then the work was not wasted, she said. Arthur continued walking, his steps carrying him back into the quiet structure of the camp, where routines held and changes remained unspoken. Behind him, Elena finished her task, placing the basin where it belonged, aligning it with the others, restoring order not by force, but by attention. The night moved forward, unremarkable to those who did not look closely. But within its stillness, something had settled. Not resolved, not concluded, but placed. The kind of placement that does not demand acknowledgement, yet alters everything that comes after. And as the lamps dimmed one by one, leaving only the faint outline of structures against the dark, the space between what was written and what was true remained, quiet and intact, waiting for the next moment that would test it again. Morning returned quietly, without announcement, the sky pale and open as if nothing had been carried over from the day before. The air was cooler now, holding a clarity that made every sound sharper, every movement more defined. Boots struck the ground with a firmer rhythm, the mud from yesterday reduced to faint patches along the edges of the yard. The camp resumed its pattern, precise and familiar, but beneath that pattern, something remained unsettled, not in conflict, but in awareness. Inside the medical barracks, the first light filtered through the windows, casting long, clean lines across the tables. Elena was already at work. She moved between stations with the same measured pace, preparing instruments, checking notes, adjusting small details that most would overlook. Her presence did not draw attention. It did not need to, but it was noticed. A senior medic entered, carrying a clipboard, his expression neutral, his posture exact. He paused when he saw her, just briefly, then continued across the room. The patient from yesterday, he said without looking directly at her, has been reassessed. Elena did not stop her work. Yes, she replied. The medic glanced down at the clipboard. Your initial concern was noted. The word lingered slightly, as if it had replaced something else. The condition was not stable, he added. Elena adjusted the position of a metal tray, aligning it with the edge of the table. That is consistent, she said. The medic nodded once, then moved on, marking something on the page with a short, deliberate motion. No apology, no correction, just a shift in record. Across the room, the younger nurse from the previous day watched the exchange in silence, her hands pausing mid-task before resuming. Outside, Arthur stood near the center of the yard, reviewing the morning assignments. His voice was calm, even, giving instructions without emphasis, without repetition. The men around him listened more closely than usual, not because the orders were different, but because the space in which they were given had changed. When he finished, the group dispersed quickly, each man moving with purpose, but also with a subtle awareness of being observed in a way that was not about discipline, but about choice. Arthur stepped aside, his eyes scanning the camp not for errors, but for alignment. Near the medical barracks, he saw Elena step outside, carrying a small tray of supplies. She moved toward a shaded area where a few cots had been arranged for observation, her posture unchanged, her focus steady. He watched as she set the tray down, checked a chart, and adjusted a blanket with a simple, efficient motion. No hesitation. No excess. Just work. A lieutenant approached Arthur from behind, his tone measured. "Sir, the revised report has been submitted." Arthur nodded slightly. "And the classification?" "Removed," the lieutenant said. "Replaced with procedural note." Arthur glanced toward the barracks again. "Good," he said. The lieutenant hesitated, then added, "There has been discussion among the men." Arthur turned his head slightly. "There usually is," he replied. "They are asking where the line is," the lieutenant continued, "between following orders and interpreting them." Arthur held his gaze for a moment, then looked back out across the yard. "The line has not moved," he said. "They are just seeing it now." The lieutenant absorbed this, though the answer did not simplify the question. He nodded and stepped back. Arthur remained where he was for a moment longer, then began walking toward the far side of the camp. As he passed the storage shed, he did not stop. The sign remained inside, unchanged, unseen. It no longer needed to be part of the day. Near the observation area, Elena finished her check and stepped back, making a small note on the chart before placing it at the foot of the cot. She turned and saw Arthur approaching. Their eyes met briefly, not as strangers, not as allies, but as two people who had already understood something without needing to say it. He stopped a few feet away. "The reassessment confirmed your judgment," he said. Elena nodded once. "Yes. The report reflects that," he added. She did not respond immediately. Then, simply, "It should." Arthur studied her for a moment. The same quiet observation as before, not searching for reaction, but confirming consistency. It was still there, unchanged. "You did not argue your case," he said. Elena looked at him directly. "I was not asked to argue," she replied. "Only to agree." The distinction settled again, clear and unforced. Arthur nodded slightly. "And you still would not?" he asked. A brief pause. Not uncertainty. Consideration. "No," she said. No explanation followed. None was needed. The morning light shifted slightly, casting new angles across the ground, stretching shadows in directions that would not last long. Around them, the camp continued its work, the rhythm steady, the structure intact. But within that structure, something had been adjusted, not in rule, not in command, but in recognition. Arthur glanced toward the post in the distance. It stood as it always had, unmarked, unremarkable. Nothing about it suggested what it had held the day before. And yet, the absence was still present, not visible, but understood. He turned back to Elena. "Continue your work," he said. "Not as an order, as acknowledgement." She inclined her head once, then returned to the tray, lifting it with steady hands, and moving to the next station. Arthur watched for a moment, then walked on, his steps carrying him back into the structure of the camp, where everything looked the same, and nothing quite was. The morning unfolded without interruption, but beneath its surface, a quiet standard had been set, not written, not announced, but held in the space where a decision had once been made and would now be remembered. By midday, the camp no longer carried the tension of something unresolved, but it did not return to what it had been either. The change was not visible in structure or sound. Orders were still given. Tasks were still completed. But there was a difference in how people paused, how they looked, how they chose their next step. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone not paying attention, yet it shaped everything that followed. In the medical area, the flow of work continued with quiet precision. Elena moved between patients and tables, her actions consistent, her attention fixed on details that required no audience. The younger nurse worked beside her now with more certainty, her movements less hesitant, her hands aligning cloth and instruments with growing care. She watched Elena not out of curiosity anymore, but as if observing a method she had not been taught but had begun to understand. The reassessment report was circulated, she said quietly, keeping her voice low even though no one had asked her to. Elena adjusted a small instrument on the tray before answering. Yes. The younger nurse hesitated. They changed the wording. Elena did not look up. They corrected the wording, she said. The difference was small, but it settled into the room with weight. Across the yard, a group of soldiers worked near the supply crates, their movements coordinated, their conversation minimal. One of them glanced toward the medical area, then back to his task. Is it true? Another asked under his breath. That she refused? The first soldier nodded slightly, and stayed with it. There was no judgment in his tone, only recognition. The second soldier adjusted the crate in his hands, thinking for a moment before speaking again. Would you have? He asked. The first soldier did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then back at the crate, then finally shook his head once. I do not know, he said. It was the first honest answer either of them had given all morning. Near the command post, Arthur reviewed a set of documents, his attention moving steadily across each line. The language was precise, controlled, designed to maintain order while allowing space for correction. He finished reading, then closed the folder without hesitation. A senior officer approached, his posture formal, his tone measured. Captain Hayes, he said, your decision yesterday has been noted. Arthur met his gaze calmly. It was observed, he replied. The officer inclined his head slightly. There are concerns about precedent. Arthur did not respond immediately. He looked past the officer, toward the open yard, toward the space that no longer held what it once had. Precedent is not created by action, he said after a moment. It is created by repetition. The officer studied him, considering the words. And, you do not believe this will be repeated? Arthur's expression remained unchanged. That depends on what is asked next time, he said. The answer did not resolve the concern. It reframed it. The officer nodded once, then stepped back, the conversation complete without conclusion. Near the observation area, Elena finished recording a note and stepped aside, allowing another medic to take her place. She moved toward the edge of the yard, where the light fell more evenly, where the air felt less confined. She stopped there briefly, not resting, not withdrawing, simply pausing. The younger nurse approached her after a moment, her steps more certain now. Do you think they understand? She asked quietly. Elena looked out across the yard, her gaze steady, not searching for anything specific. Understanding is not required, she said. The younger nurse frowned slightly. Then what is? Elena turned her head just enough to meet her eyes. Clarity, she said. The word remained between them, simple, exact. The younger nurse nodded slowly, as if the answer had shifted something she had not yet defined. Across the camp, movement continued, but the rhythm had changed again, not slower, not faster, but more deliberate. Decisions were being made with a fraction more attention, a brief pause where there had been none before. It did not disrupt the system. It refined it. Arthur walked along the central path, his steps steady, his presence no longer drawing the same silent reactions as before. The attention had not disappeared. It had settled into something quieter, more internal. He passed the storage shed without looking in, the sign inside no longer part of his awareness. It had served its purpose. Its absence now carried more meaning than its presence had before. As he reached the far side of the camp, he stopped briefly, looking back across the space. The post stood as it always had, unchanged, unremarkable, but it was no longer a point of focus. It had returned to being part of the background, a structure without narrative. And yet, the memory of what had happened there remained, not as an image, but as a reference point, something others would measure against without speaking of it. The afternoon light shifted again, casting new angles, new shadows, changing the way surfaces reflected and absorbed the world around them. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just change, steady and continuous. Elena turned back toward the barracks, her steps as measured as before, her attention returning fully to the work that had never stopped. The younger nurse followed a moment later, carrying the tray she had prepared herself this time, her hands steady, her movements precise. The camp continued. Orders were followed. Reports were written. Structures remained intact. But within all of it, something had been adjusted, not loudly, not formally, but permanently enough to be felt. Not everyone could name it. Not everyone needed to. It was there in the pause before agreement, in the second look at a line already written, in the quiet recognition that something simple could still be chosen differently. And as the day moved forward, that recognition remained, shaping each small decision in ways no report could fully record. By late afternoon, the pattern of the camp had settled into something that felt stable on the surface, yet carried a deeper layer of attention beneath it. The sun hung lower now, casting a warmer tone across the wooden structures, softening edges, stretching shadows into long, quiet lines that moved slowly across the ground. Nothing in the routine had changed in any visible way. Orders were still followed. Work was still completed. But the space between instruction and action had gained weight, as if each decision now passed through an extra moment of consideration before becoming real. In the administrative office, the revised report had already begun its quiet journey through the system. It sat now among other documents, indistinguishable in format, identical in structure, yet carrying a subtle difference that could not be measured in ink. The clerk who had rewritten it glanced at the stack more than once, not out of doubt, but out of awareness. He had not altered the facts. He had not removed the event. He had only adjusted the certainty. And in doing so, he had introduced something the forms were not designed to hold. Across the yard, a pair of soldiers worked near the water station, filling containers in steady rhythm. One of them paused briefly, watching as another officer passed by, then resumed his task without comment. The second soldier noticed the pause. "You are thinking about it again," he said quietly. The first soldier did not deny it. "It was a simple thing," he said. And yet it was not. The second soldier adjusted the handle of the pump, letting the water flow into the container with a steady, controlled stream. "Simple things usually are not," he replied. The first soldier nodded once, then lifted the filled container and carried it away, his steps measured, his expression thoughtful. Near the medical barracks, Elena continued her work without interruption, moving from one station to another with the same steady precision. The younger nurse followed her pace now without hesitation, her movements aligned, her attention focused. She no longer watched Elena for instruction. She worked beside her as if the method had already been absorbed. The senior medic reviewed the case again, she said softly. Elena adjusted a chart, her eyes scanning the details before marking a small note. "Yes," she replied. "He agreed with your assessment," the younger nurse added. Elena set the chart down, aligning it carefully with the others. "He confirmed it," she said. The difference, once again, was small but exact. The younger nurse paused, considering the words, then nodded slowly, as if understanding was no longer something she was seeking, but something she was recognizing. At the far edge of the camp, Arthur stood near a line of crates, reviewing a delivery log. His attention moved steadily across the page, but his awareness extended beyond it, taking in the movement around him, the subtle changes in how people carried themselves, the quiet adjustments that did not require instruction. A junior officer approached, his posture formal, his tone careful. "Sir, there has been feedback from command," he said. Arthur looked up briefly. "There usually is," he replied. The officer hesitated, then continued. "They have noted your decision as situational." Arthur closed the log and set it aside. "It was," he said. The officer shifted slightly. "They are considering guidance to clarify similar situations in the future." Arthur nodded once. "Clarity is useful," he said. The officer studied him for a moment, then asked, "And if clarity is not provided?" Arthur met his gaze directly. "Then it will be created in the moment it is needed," he said. The answer did not challenge authority. It defined responsibility. The officer nodded, though the weight of the statement lingered longer than the conversation itself. Arthur turned and began walking along the central path, his steps steady, his presence no longer drawing the same quiet reactions as before. The attention had shifted from him to something larger, something less visible but more present. As he passed the storage shed, he did not look inside. The sign remained there, unchanged, but no longer relevant to the movement of the day. Its purpose had been fulfilled not by what it declared, but by what it failed to hold. Near the observation area, Elena finished her final check of the afternoon and stepped back, her hands resting briefly at her sides before moving to the next task. Arthur approached, stopping at a familiar distance. "The case has been closed," he said. Elena looked at him, her expression unchanged. "Cases do not close," she replied. "They are only recorded." Arthur considered this, then nodded slightly. "And the record?" he asked. Elena turned her gaze briefly toward the charts, the notes, the ordered lines of information that attempted to contain what had happened. "It reflects what can be written," she said. The distinction remained, quiet but unmistakable. Arthur glanced across the yard, toward the post that now stood without meaning, without attention. "And what cannot be written?" he asked. Elena met his eyes again. "It remains," she said. No elaboration followed. None was needed. The afternoon light shifted again, lowering further, casting longer shadows that blurred the edges of structure and space. Around them, the camp continued, steady, organized, unchanged in form. But within that form, something had been set, not as a rule, not as a command, but as a reference. Something others would return to, not because they were told to, but because they had seen it once and could not unsee it. Arthur inclined his head slightly, then turned and walked on, his steps carrying him back into the pattern of the camp as the day moved toward evening. Behind him, Elena returned to her work, her movements unchanged, her focus steady. The younger nurse followed, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, simply continuing. And as the sun lowered toward the horizon, the space between what was expected and what was chosen remained, quiet and present, shaping each moment without needing to be named. The evening settled slowly, the kind that did not announce itself but revealed its presence through the quieting of movement and the softening of sound. The last tasks of the day were being completed with a steady rhythm. Tools returned to their places, notes finalized, small details aligned, as if order itself required no effort, only attention. The sky shifted into a deeper shade, the light no longer stretching shadows but dissolving them into the ground. What had been visible all day began to blend into a uniform calm. Inside the administrative office, the final version of the report was filed into its proper place, indistinguishable from the others in form, yet carrying a difference no label could capture. The clerk closed the cabinet with a careful motion, his hand resting on the handle for a moment longer than necessary, as if acknowledging that something had passed through his hands that would not remain contained there. Across the room, the senior officer reviewed a separate set of documents, his expression unchanged, his posture composed. "It will not be referenced again," he said without looking up. The clerk nodded, though the words did not settle as final. Some things did not require reference to remain present. Outside, the camp moved into its evening pattern, quieter now, more contained. Voices lowered, footsteps spaced farther apart, the air carrying a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed. Arthur walked along the central path, his coat buttoned against the cooler air, his pace unhurried. He passed the same structures, the same spaces, but each carried a familiarity that had shifted, not in appearance, but in meaning. Near the medical barracks, the lights had dimmed again, leaving only a single glow near the far side of the room. Through the window, Elena was still at work, finishing what remained of the day with the same precision she had shown from the beginning. There was no sign of fatigue in her movements, no change in the way she handled each task. Consistency had become its own form of presence. Arthur stopped briefly, not close enough to interrupt, not far enough to ignore. He watched as she placed a final note on a chart, her handwriting steady, each line clear, each word exact. There was nothing in the motion that suggested the weight of what had happened. And yet, it was there, in the absence of hesitation, in the refusal to adjust what did not need to be adjusted. He moved on without speaking, the moment complete without acknowledgement. Near the storage shed, he paused once more, though this time he did not step inside. The sign remained where it had been placed, unseen, unchanged, no longer part of the visible order of the camp. It had been removed not by force, but by irrelevance. Its meaning had dissolved the moment it no longer aligned with what had been observed. Arthur stood there for a moment, then turned away, the action quiet, final. At the far edge of the yard, a small group of soldiers gathered briefly before dispersing, their conversation low, their movements deliberate. One of them lingered a second longer than the others, looking back toward the center of the camp, toward the space that no longer held what it had the day before. He did not speak. He did not need to. The memory was enough. Inside the medical barracks, Elena finished her last task and stepped back, her hands resting at her sides for a brief moment before she reached to extinguish the lamp. The room dimmed further, the light fading into shadow, leaving only the outlines of the space behind. She paused near the doorway, looking out into the evening, her gaze steady, not searching, not reflecting, simply present. The younger nurse had already left, her steps more confident than they had been that morning, her movements aligned with something she had not been taught but had begun to carry. Elena stepped outside, the cool air meeting her without resistance. The camp lay before her, quiet, ordered, unchanged in structure. But within that structure, something had been placed, something that would remain long after the details of the day had faded. Arthur crossed the yard at a distance, their paths not intersecting, their roles not overlapping, yet connected by a moment that had required neither acknowledgement nor repetition. He did not look toward her. She did not call out. The connection did not require confirmation. It existed in what had already been understood. The night deepened, the last traces of movement settling into stillness. Lights dimmed one by one, leaving the camp in a quiet equilibrium that held both routine and something beyond it. The post stood at the edge of the yard, unchanged, unmarked, no longer carrying any meaning beyond its function. And yet, it remained a reference, not in sight, but in memory. Arthur reached the far end of the path and stopped briefly, looking out across the space that had held the day. There was nothing to see now. No sign. No interruption. Just order. But beneath that order, something had been set, not as a rule, not as a directive, but as a measure. He turned and walked on, his steps blending into the quiet of the night, his presence no longer distinct from the structure he moved within. And as the final light disappeared, leaving only the faint outline of the camp against the dark sky, the space between what was written and what was true remained, unchanged, waiting, not for recognition, but for the next moment that would require it to be chosen again. The night held steady, deep and uninterrupted, as if the camp itself had decided not to disturb what had already settled. The air carried a quiet clarity, the kind that made even the smallest sound distinct, a distant footstep, the faint movement of canvas, the soft closing of a door. Nothing demanded attention, yet everything felt observed, not by others, but by the memory of what had already occurred. Arthur remained awake longer than usual, not out of restlessness, but out of awareness. He sat at a small desk in his quarters, a single lamp casting a narrow circle of light across the surface. Papers were arranged in front of him, reports that required review, notes that needed confirmation. His eyes moved across them with precision, but not all of his attention was there. Some of it remained elsewhere, in a space that could not be written into any of the documents before him. He reached for a pen, paused, then set it back down. Not everything required a mark. Across the camp, the medical barracks had gone quiet. The last light had been extinguished, leaving only the faint outline of its structure against the night. Inside, Elena rested on a narrow cot near the back wall, her posture still composed even in stillness. Her hands were folded lightly, not in tension, not in thought, simply placed. Sleep did not come immediately, not because of disturbance, but because of clarity. The day had not required reflection. It had required presence. And now, in the absence of movement, that presence remained, not as a question, but as something already understood. Outside, a guard moved along the perimeter, his steps steady, his gaze scanning the same lines he had walked countless times before. He passed the post without slowing, without noticing it as anything more than part of the structure. And yet, for a brief moment, something in his pace shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the space carried a memory he could not name. He continued on, the moment gone before it could be examined. Near the storage shed, the sign remained where it had been placed, turned inward, its surface hidden from view. It did not change. It did not need to. Its presence was no longer active. It had been replaced by something less visible, but more enduring. In the administrative office, the final report rested within its file, its language fixed, its tone controlled. The system had absorbed the event, contained it within structure, reduced it to sequence and description. But the system had not defined it. It had only recorded what could be recorded. The rest remained outside its reach. Arthur stood from his desk and walked to the small window, looking out across the darkened camp. The outlines of the buildings were faint, the paths barely visible, the entire space reduced to form without detail. It looked simple from this distance. Ordered. Predictable. But he knew better. He had seen where that order could fail, not through chaos, but through assumption. He rested his hand lightly against the window frame, not in thought, not in hesitation, just in contact. Then he stepped back, the motion complete without reflection. Morning would come. Routine would resume. The system would continue as it always had. But something within it had been adjusted, not in rule, not in command, but in recognition. He turned away from the window and extinguished the lamp, the room falling into darkness without resistance. Across the camp, the same darkness settled into every space, equal, undivided, holding everything without distinction. Elena's eyes closed eventually, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. There was no need to revisit the day. It had already placed itself where it belonged. Not in memory, in measure. The guard completed his round and returned to his post, his report simple, unchanged, nothing to note. And yet, something had been noted, not by him, not by any report, but by the quiet alignment that had passed through the camp and remained. The knight did not comment. It did not explain. It simply held what had occurred, without altering it, without diminishing it. And as the hours passed, one after another, without interruption, the space between what was written and what was true remained intact, waiting not for acknowledgement, but for the next moment that would reveal whether it would be held again. Morning returned with a kind of quiet certainty, the light spreading evenly across the camp as if nothing had been interrupted, as if everything had simply continued through the night without pause. The air carried a crispness that made each sound distinct, boots against packed earth, the low murmur of early instructions, the distant movement of equipment being set into place. Routine resumed, but it did not erase what had been set. It revealed it. Arthur stepped out into the yard just as the first assignments were being given, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but the way others registered him had shifted. It was no longer a matter of rank alone. It was something quieter, less visible, but more exact. A measure had been observed, and now it remained. He moved along the central path, reviewing the morning preparations with the same precision as always, his eyes noting alignment, not enforcing it, simply recognizing where it held and where it did not. Near the administrative office, the clerk from the previous day stood outside for a moment longer than necessary before returning to his desk, as if the act of stepping into that room now required a different kind of attention. He sat down, opened a new file, and paused before writing the first line. The hesitation was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Not uncertainty, awareness. He began to write, each word placed carefully, not only for accuracy, but for alignment with something that could not be fully expressed. Across the yard, the group of soldiers assigned to supply detail worked in coordinated silence, their movements efficient, their communication minimal. One of them reached for a crate, then paused, adjusting his grip slightly before lifting it. The change was small, but deliberate. He did not rush. He did not assume. He moved with attention, as if each action now carried a weight that did not come from the object itself, but from the choice behind it. Near the medical barracks, Elena stepped outside into the morning light, a small tray in her hands, her movements unchanged, her pace steady. The younger nurse followed a step behind, no longer uncertain, her posture aligned, her attention focused without strain. They moved toward the observation area, their steps even, their presence quiet but exact. Arthur noticed them as he passed, his gaze resting for a moment, not to assess, not to question, but to confirm what had already been established. It remained. He continued walking. At the observation area, Elena set the tray down and began her checks, her hands moving with the same precision, the same consistency that had defined her actions from the beginning. The younger nurse mirrored her movements, not perfectly, but with intention, her hands steady, her attention clear. They are watching more closely now, she said softly, not as a concern, but as an observation. Elena adjusted a chart, her eyes scanning the details before marking a note. They are seeing more clearly, she replied. The distinction settled quietly, without emphasis. The younger nurse nodded once, her understanding no longer forming, but present. Across the camp, a senior officer walked through the central path, his posture formal, his expression composed. He paused briefly near the administrative office, exchanging a few quiet words with the clerk, then continued on, his pace unchanged. As he passed the supply area, he glanced toward the men at work, his gaze sharper than before, not searching for error, but for alignment. The system remained intact, but its observation had deepened. Arthur reached the far edge of the yard and stopped briefly, looking back across the space that now held the morning. There was no trace of the previous day in any visible form. No sign, no interruption, just structure, order, routine. But within that structure, something had been placed, not as a rule, not as a directive, but as a reference. Something others were already adjusting to, not because they had been told to, but because they had seen it once and understood its weight. He turned and walked back toward the center, his steps steady, his presence no longer requiring acknowledgement. It had become part of the measure itself. Near the storage shed, he paused again, not entering, not looking inside. The sign remained unseen, unchanged, its absence from the visible space now complete. It no longer belonged to the day. It had been replaced by something that could not be removed, because it had never been placed in the same way. Inside the medical barracks, the work continued, the rhythm steady, the attention precise. Elena moved from one station to another, her actions consistent, her presence unchanged. The younger nurse followed, no longer questioning, no longer observing from a distance, but participating, fully in the method she had begun to carry. The morning advanced, the light shifting slightly, the shadows adjusting with it. Nothing dramatic occurred. Nothing needed to. The change had already taken place, and now it remained, shaping each small decision, each quiet moment where something could be assumed or examined, accepted or considered. Arthur crossed the yard once more, his steps blending into the pattern of the camp, his attention steady, his presence aligned with the structure that held everything together. And as the day continued, unfolding without interruption, the space between what was written and what was true remained, not as a question, not as a conflict, but as a standard, quiet and exact, waiting only to be met again. The day moved forward without resistance, the kind of continuation that did not announce itself, but revealed its presence through consistency. The sun rose higher, light spreading evenly across the camp, touching every surface without distinction, making no effort to highlight what had changed and what had not. From a distance, everything appeared the same. Rows of structures, defined paths, measured movement. But for those within it, the difference no longer needed to be identified. It had already been absorbed. Arthur walked along the central path one final time before the midday shift, his pace steady, his attention no longer searching, but confirming. He passed the administrative office, where the clerk now worked without hesitation, each document handled with care, each line written with a precision that did not come from instruction alone. The pause that had once existed before writing had not disappeared. It had become part of the process itself, no longer visible, fully integrated. Near the supply area, the soldiers moved with the same coordination as before, but without the quiet uncertainty that had marked the previous day. Their actions were no longer reactive. They were considered. One of them lifted a crate, adjusted his grip once, then carried it forward without strain, his movement aligned with intention rather than habit. No one commented. No one needed to. The adjustment had become natural. At the medical barracks, Elena continued her work as she always had, her presence unchanged, her movement steady, her attention exact. The younger nurse worked beside her now without hesitation, her hands mirroring the same precision, her posture aligned with the rhythm she had learned not through instruction, but through observation. They moved together in quiet coordination, their actions unspoken, their understanding complete. They no longer asked the same questions, the younger nurse said softly, as she arranged a set of instruments. Elena did not look up. They are no longer asking the wrong ones, she replied. The words settled into the space without resistance, simple, exact. Outside, Arthur paused briefly near the observation area, his gaze resting for a moment on the work being done, not to assess, not to interfere, but to confirm what had already been established. It remained unchanged, He turned and continued on, his presence no longer distinct from the structure around him. It had become part of it. At the far edge of the yard, the post stood as it always had, unchanged, unremarkable, its surface holding no visible trace of what it had once carried. It had returned fully to its function, a structure without meaning beyond its form. And yet, it remained a point of reference, not because it was seen, but because it had been understood. Arthur stopped there for a moment, not in reflection, not in memory, but in recognition. He placed his hand lightly against the wood, just as he had before, feeling its solidity, its stillness, its complete indifference to what had been placed upon it. It did not hold meaning. People did. He withdrew his hand and stepped back, the motion quiet, final. Across the yard, movement continued, steady, uninterrupted. Orders were given. Tasks were completed. Nothing had been disrupted. And yet, something had been set, not in rule, not in command, but in measure. Something that would not appear in reports. Something that would not be taught directly. Something that would only exist in the moment it was needed, when someone paused, looked again, and chose. Elena finished her final task of the morning and stepped outside, the light meeting her without resistance. She paused briefly near the edge of the yard, her gaze steady, not searching, not reflecting, simply present. Arthur crossed the path at a distance, their movements intersecting only in awareness, not in action. No words were exchanged. None were required. The understanding had already been completed. The younger nurse stepped outside moments later, her posture aligned, her attention clear, her presence no longer uncertain. She looked once toward Elena, then toward the yard, then back again, as if measuring something she now carried without, needing to define it. The day continued. The light shifted. Shadows adjusted. The camp remained. And within it, the space between what was written and what was true no longer felt separate. It had been bridged, not by instruction, not by force, but by a single moment that had been seen, understood, and then carried forward without announcement. Arthur turned and walked back into the pattern of the camp, his steps steady, his presence quiet. Elena returned to her work, her movements unchanged, her attention precise. Nothing had been added. Nothing had been taken away. And yet, everything had been adjusted. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely enough that it would remain. And in the quiet continuation of the day, where no one spoke of what had happened, where no record fully contained it, the standard remained, not as a rule, not as a memory, but as something simpler, something exact, something that did not need to be said again to be followed. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. She did not change what was written. She simply refused to sign what was not true. And that was enough.